Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I hope things are going fine where you are, and go and get yourself a lovely drink. You deserve to spoil yourself. I really appreciate all my listeners so very much. You're all like extended family to me, so you all mean the world to me, and I just hope you're doing remarkably well today. And I am so glad you've joined me for part 2 of our story. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. The worst thing of all, Owen had promptly decided, was the very fact that he was no longer number one in somebody else's life, as he had been Dorothy's number one, and she had been his. Let's just say his family members all had lives of their own, so he was now truly alone in the world, and the insufferable solitude he felt seemed to strangle his hope like a boa constrictor, squeezing the very life out of everything. It was very difficult for Owen to get out of bed in the morning these days, and over the last month he'd not left his house at all. His truck remained stoically parked in the carport and was gathering a plethora of dust that was so bad you could actually write your name in it. The tenacious grass in his yard was growing longer, week by week. Weeds were audaciously sprouting through the white gravel paths, and as for the summer seedlings his wife had painstakingly planted, they would already be dead if it hadn't been for all the rain they enjoyed of late. One of the blessings of living in Washington state, you could say. Owen noticed his clothes hung on him like loose rags. The last time he'd been this skinny was when he was 18 years old, but he had acquired his long-desired waistline by merely not eating, as trips to the local grocery store no longer seemed a priority in his life, and his large appetite had dwindled away into nothing. "I'm probably depressed," he told himself, as he glanced at his emaciated, sunken reflection in the mirror. When he'd been married to Dorothy, he'd always made sure he was cleanly shaved, and his full head of white hair that framed his square jawline was trimmed to perfection, but not any more. When he looked in the mirror, his face looked thin, his gaunt cheeks were all but sunken hollows, his lugubrious eyes buried behind deep recesses, and his normally perfectly shaved skin now supported a wispy white beard. And if that wasn't bad enough, his hair seemed to have become untamed and wild, hanging around his face in limp, lifeless locks that were begging for a hairdresser's kindly hands to tidy them up. For some reason Owen found hiding out in his home, snuggling up to his grief like a book with the treasured memories of his beloved wife, was all he could do, as he had absolutely no energy left for anything else. He was permanently exhausted, completely drained. Everything these days had become a tireless, monumental effort, a laborious struggle, a mission. He found himself whiling away the long, lonely hours, going through treasured albums of nostalgic photographs, watching family videos of happier days. He was cocooned in the silken trappings of his grief, like a fly ensnared in a spider's web. Owen felt safe, very secure, in the confines of his home, a private, blissful sanctuary where he could stay close to his memories and rekindle them at a moment's notice, like a video you might watch again and again and again. Owen took himself away on old family vacations and trips abroad, reliving every single poignant moment, so vividly in his mind, as if he'd boarded a time machine and rolled the clock steadily backwards to treasured times that he remembered so well. Sometimes his visions were so real, he could almost feel the cold sea water rushing over his toes when his wife had been with him on that Florida beach. He could remember the coin he'd thrown in the Trevi fountain in Italy, and the exquisite trip to the island of Capri, surrounded by the shimmering turquoise waters of the ocean. He recalled walking down the Champs-Élysées in Paris and buying some baguette from the baker. He and his wife had strolled down the street without a care in the world, hand in hand, chewing this French bread. He could taste its fresh, crisp flavour in his mouth. You didn't get bread like that anywhere else in the world. It was getting easier and easier to remain in his house during the day, hiding from the prying, intrusive eyes of nosy neighbours. He knew what people were thinking if they saw him in the street. "There goes poor old Mr. Rochester, who lost his wife recently." The old man did not want to be the object of other people's pity, Let's just say in a neighbourhood where the residents are very house-proud, priding themselves in their pretty displays of summer flowers and mowing their lawns religiously. It didn't escape people's attention that the normally fastidious Owen Rochester, whom at one time boasted one of the finest houses and yards in the entire street, had left everything to rack and ruin, as if he no longer cared about his Queen Anne home any more. The house undoubtedly reflected his lugubrious melancholia. At one point the exquisite Queen Anne-style house, set in the middle of the street, had demanded so much attention and admiration, but in the spate of the summer the house had lost its magical allure. It looked desolate, lonely, unkept, dishevelled, with knee-high grass that was showcasing some very ugly-looking weeds, with jagged, thorny edges. The once neat hedges framing the flower beds looked like Owen's own hair, badly in need of a good trim. And some of the flowers had wilted, were being taken over by still more rambunctious weeds and creepers that tangled the pretty summer displays of flowers with their looped tentacles, choking and strangling the very life out of them. Nancy wondered whether they should intervene to help Mr. Rochester out. "I think he's having a hard time of it," she told her husband. "I mean, the poor man is in his 80s, and since his wife has died, his yard has become derelict, untamed, very neglected. I think it would be a neighbourly thing to go and lend a hand, mow his lawn for him, trim his hedges, perhaps water the flowers and do some heavy-duty weeding for him. Some of those weeds have become quite horrendous. Mr. Rochester was so proud of his yard. Look at it now. It's a complete mess. It's so unsightly. Poor Mrs. Rochester. If she were around today, it would break her heart to see such shambles and chaos and such disarray in her yard. She was so proud of those flower beds of hers." "I'm not sure it's a very good idea to interfere," her husband had said. "I mean, if we go over there and attend to his yard, he might never do anything for himself again. It'll discourage him from making an effort himself. It would do him good to get out into the fresh air and attend to his yard. It might be the very push he needs to snap him out of his grief. The man needs to keep himself busy. Otherwise he'll end up very much the same way as his wife. People can die of a broken heart, you know. We're not going to help him by doing his garden for him." "I'm not sure you're right," said Nancy. "What harm could it do to lend a helping hand while the man is down?" It was Nancy's 10-year-old son, James, who had become exceedingly worried about the old man's state of health, as over the last couple of years he'd seen the old man attending to his yard fastidiously and waving to him from the front yard as James rode past in a bicycle. "Hello there, young James," Mr. Rochester would call out, giving him a broad smile. "Hello, Mr. Rochester," he'd shout out. But these days he never saw Mr. Rochester. Indeed, over the last month there hadn't even been a sighting of his old friend, and James was exceedingly worried. One day in the late afternoon he snuck out of the family house and walked up the white gravel path, overtaken now by weeds, towards the front door of Mr. Rochester's property. He was appalled by the state of the yard that had become a rambling, overgrown thicket. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer, and he noticed when he peeked through the letterbox in the door that the entrance hall was littered with an accumulation of post that had not been touched for what seemed like weeks. James banged on the windows and doors, his knocks calling out the old man's name. "Mr. Rochester! Mr. Rochester! Are you in there, Mr. Rochester? Mr. Rochester! I just want to know if you're all right. Mr. Rochester!" There was no answer, and he felt a dreadful sense of foreboding overcome him. Supposing Mr. Rochester was dead, he thought. "I need to check on him to see he's all right." James managed to squirrel through a back window he found to the rear of the property, and began wiggling his small body over the bar that had been bent back. He landed nimbly on what appeared to be a washing machine. He must be in the laundry room. There were shelves lined with washing powder and plastic linen baskets, and there was an artificial lavender smell coming from the boxes of washing powder. James knew his mother would be terribly affronted with him for breaking into Mr. Rochester's house like this, but his instincts drove him forwards as he stealthily moved through the extensive rooms of the property, like a black panther in pursuit of his prey. He didn't know why he was tiptoeing around so furtively, but it seemed like the right thing to do in the circumstances, as after all, That's what you did when you broke into someone's house. He knew he was trespassing, and you could get into big trouble for that. But James also wisely discerned that he had to check up on the old man. If he didn't, he wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. He'd be worrying so much. He knew in his gut that something was terribly wrong. It would seem his compellingly persuasive instincts governed his grudging reluctance, egging him ever forwards, as a little effacious voice whispered in his ears, "You must check up on him. You must." The once luxurious house interiors, where no expense appeared to have been spared, were now in a messy disarray, with papers haphazardly strewn all over the place, and dust bespeckling the once magnificent walnut and oakwood Queen Anne-style antiques, looked like any other random piece of furniture now, with their glorious intricate carving and wood grain, so rudely obscured by an unsightly sticky coating of dust. The air was also so dusty and congested, compounded further by a sour smell that permeated the room, a smell of sweat and urine, he thought. It was really quite pungent and offensive. James was terribly afraid of what he was to discover. His heart tightened in his chest, almost as if he was holding his breath. His fists clenched tightly, and his stomach seemed to be fluttering like a butterfly colony. It was when he circumspectively entered the front room, with a squeamish unwillingness, that he felt the overwhelming need to get out of this place, as the oppressively claustrophobic room, with its rank sour odour, appeared to be closing in on him, and James felt that he couldn't breathe, but his doubts were valiantly conquered by the hard drive of a powerful determination that doggedly refused to give up on the old man. The large congenial box windows of this front room that overlooked the pretty views of the street were covered by the sweeping stretch of long velvety cream fabric that had been fastidiously drawn, but a tiny revealing crack of light impertinently poked through the curtain, like an intrusive prying eye, which seemed to magnanimously soften the coffee-coloured darkness of the room. That was when James stopped dead in his tracks. He could see that old Mr. Rochester was sitting there on the sofa, stoically still. He looked like a pale mannequin that was waiting for a brush of colour from an artist to turn its ghost-like silhouette into a believable, lifelike doll. No breath appeared to emanate from his lips. There appeared to be no rise or fall of the chest. "Oh, my God!" he thought, cupping his hands over his mouth. "Mr. Rochester is dead! Poor Mr. Rochester is dead!" He wanted to scream and run away as fast as he possibly could, but no words easily tumbled out of his mouth. His body seemed locked in a rigidly stiff position, as if frozen to the spot. James stared at the dishevelled, forlorn, beleaguered state of the old man, a mere shadow of what he'd once been. Mr. Rochester's melancholic face was so sunken in, his cheeks hollow. The crestfallen skin clung to his face like an opaque but papery body stocking. He looked like some of the woeful, faded, inscrutable pictures James had seen of the anguish-starved people from the Holocaust, with their vacuously vacant stares and deadpan expressionless faces. James thought that Mr. Rochester was dead. He had to be. He stood there staring at Mr. Rochester, dread soaring through his soul on the wings of an eagle, riding the storm clouds of trepidation, uncertainty. "Go away! Run!" screamed the voice inside him, but James refused to listen to its pathetic whimpering wails. Slowly, with a cautious reluctance and a vacillating hesitancy, he crept steadily forward, poking Mr. Rochester in the shoulder. And when two eyes suddenly popped open, James finally let out a shrill scream, as the sudden jerking movements of Mr. Rochester's closed eyes suddenly opening had scared him half to death. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rochester. I was just so terribly worried about you. I was knocking outside for ages, banging on windows, calling your name, but you didn't respond. And I noticed that your post had piled up in the entrance hall. I knew I had to check on you to see that you were all right. So I'm sorry, but I climbed through your laundry window. I know it's wrong, but please don't be angry with me." "Why don't you mind your own business and leave me alone?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Rochester, about your wife's death. I really am. I liked her, Mr. Rochester. She made the best apple pie in the whole wide world. I miss it an awful lot. I miss the both of you." The old man seemed to suddenly soften. His eyes glinted with tears.
She did, didn't she? I missed that apple pie too, young man. It was quite the most delicious apple pie I've ever tasted. No one made it quite like my wife.
The best, said James, the very best. He studied Mr. Rochester more closely. He was wearing pyjamas and slippers, and had covered himself with a blanket, and his fragile skin looked like crepe paper. James was sure the acrid vinegary smell in the house came from Mr. Rochester himself. He probably hadn't had a bath in a very long time. Only being 10 years old, James had never been the kind of boy to skirt on his thoughts that adults might be prone to do for fear of causing offence or hurt. Instead, James was refreshingly honest, which was possibly a blessing in disguise. Mr. Rochester needed to be hit hard with some sobering home truths that from an adult might not have been as comfortable to hear, but coming from an innocent, well-meaning 10-year-old boy with an open, sincere heart and a genuine concern was not so objectionable or derogatory.
Mr. Rochester, I don't mean to be rude, but you don't smell too good. And your house is a really bad mess. You look like you haven't eaten for a very long time. You're terribly thin. I think Mrs. Rochester would be so sad to see you like this. She'd hate the way your yard looks. I see it's so overgrown, it's full of weeds, and she loved her flower bed so much.
You're right, son. She'd be very disappointed in me. She'd tell me to pull myself together. But it's not easy, you know. I miss her so dreadfully much. I've lost my very best friend.
I know it's really sad you lost your wife, Mr. Rochester, but your wife is looking down on you from the clouds. I bet she's crying. She's so sad because she doesn't like you looking so bad. And you don't care any more. She can see that. I could run you a bath if you like, Mr. Rochester. And I could heat you up something to eat. You've got so thin. I'd love to be able to help you.
You know, James, I think I'll take you up on your offer. I'll have that bath. It sounds like a very good idea to me. Do you know my wife hated beards? She'd recoil if she could see I'd grown one, so I think I need a good shave as well.
While Mr. Rochester was shaving and bathing, James examined the food in the kitchen and realised the kitchen was clean and tidy. It hadn't been used in weeks, although the surfaces were undoubtedly sprinkled in a fine coating of dust. There was a selection of unwashed coffee mugs in the sink, but it looked like Mr. Rochester hadn't eaten a thing in ages. He wrinkled his nose in abject disgust when he opened the refrigerator. Everything ponged and smelt disgusting. The milk had gone sour, cheese had grown mould, and condiments appeared to have grown fluff on their surfaces, not to mention deflated vegetables in plastic bags that had turned to a filthy, pungent water. James decided to examine the freezer, and found a plethora of frozen casseroles flung into the cabinet, obviously made by well-meaning residents in their street. James industriously defrosted a chicken casserole and rice in the microwave. Then he popped it into a warm oven. James might have only been 10 years old, but he knew his way around the kitchen, better than some adults did. When Mr. Rochester appeared from the bathroom, wearing some sweats and a T-shirt, he looked like a whole new man. His beard had been shaven away. He smelt of apple shampoo, although he still looked like the skeleton they were studying at school in biology. But James knew better than to tell him that. Some things you just didn't say, and that skeleton in the school biology classroom was not a pretty specimen by any manner of means. Before long, Mr. Rochester was tucking away into a casserole and rice. He made a poor showing due to his diminished appetite, but at least it was a start, and he certainly seemed more spirited and upbeat. James had no way of knowing how his spontaneous visit had brought the old man back to life.
"This is delicious, young man," said Mr. Rochester appreciatively.
"Don't look at me, Mr. Rochester. I found it in your freezer. You haven't been shopping for ages, have you? Your fridge is really stinky. If you want to get some shopping in, you can always ask my mother. I know she'd love to help you out. Everybody's worried about you."
James went to collect Mr. Rochester's post from the front passage. He had a massive pearl in his hand, which he brought in for the old man.
"I got your post, Mr. Rochester. Look what I found on your floor among the post."
It was a single large white feather, which he presented to Mr. Rochester. It was a magnificent feather, long and white.
Mr. Rochester's eyes grew wide. "Where on earth did that come from?" he asked incredulously. "How did a white feather end up in my home, along with the post?"
James shrugged his shoulder.
"I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? I've never seen a feather like that before."
"You know my Dorothy loved white feathers," said Mr. Rochester. "I remember she told me once that if she died before I did, she'd send me white feathers to tell me she loved me. She said the white feathers would be symbolic. They would mean that she was happy where she was and watching over me."
"Do you think the white feather is from her?" asked James. "Do you think she sent it to you in the post?"
"I don't know," said Mr. Rochester, his eyes brightening, as if somewhere in his heart a glimmer of hope had bounded through the veil of darkness that had consumed his life for so many weeks. "I'd like to think so. I've never in my 50 years of life stumbled across a white feather like that. And I've never believed in coincidences."
"I definitely think it's from her, Mr. Rochester," said James. "I'm sure your wife sent it to you. She sent it to you from heaven to tell you she's happy. She wants you to know she's watching over you."
"If that's the case," said Mr. Rochester, "I better clean up my act. Look at me. I'm a mess."
When James informed his mother about Mr. Rochester's bleak condition, the family became much more involved in the old man's life. His mother fastidiously cleaned up his house, cleared out the fridges for him, aired out the rooms, removed the dust, the cobwebs and the mouse droppings, shined up the furniture, did some shopping for him, picking up tempting fresh food from the grocer's and bakery, while his father cleared, weeded, mowed and watered the yard, so that once again the Queen Anne house, that was a prominent feature in the street, rose up like a phoenix from the ashes to fight yet another day, to reclaim her illustrious prominence among the community, and the yard with its now perfectly mown lawn that had been skilfully weeded, while tired flowers were revived. It had all been brought back to its former pristine condition. Nancy ensured that she regularly invited Mr. Rochester over for dinner, and the old man was regaining his strength, and he seemed to have a renewed vigour to his step. He was becoming a part of their extended family. James made certain he visited the old man as often as he could, as he believed that Mr. Rochester was hungry for company, and of course some good conversation, and it seemed his regular trips to see the old man had lifted him out of his lugubrious melancholia. One day, for reasons he could not explain, Mr. Rochester decided to take a walk in the woodgrove behind his property at night. He would describe the feeling as an overwhelming urge that he simply could not push away or disregard. It was as if the towering, lofty trees of the woodgrove had been calling out his name. It would seem over the last few nights he had been dreaming very vividly of his wife. The dream had been reoccurring and very lucid. He found himself in a woodgrove with ponderosa pine trees, which he recognised as the wooded sanctuary that fringed their property. His wife had dearly loved those trees, and the sweet butterscotch-like scent of the pine was very pronounced. In the dream the forest is arrestingly silent for a moment, but then a whispering wind whistles through the trees with a sound that appears to be calling his name. "Owen! Owen! Owen!" The trees call out to him, their needled boughs swaggering in the breeze. Then he sees this woman in a floating, white, ethereal gown running towards him down the woodland trail, in her bare feet, with her strawberry blonde hair blowing up against the wind like some of those glamorous shampoo adverts, as the ambiguous young lady gets ever closer, and Owen recognises the woman at once. It was his wife when she was in her early 20s. She was young, her skin radiantly full, her eyes as blue as the ocean, her smile broad and wide. It is then Owen notices at her side were 2 deers running with her like devoted, loving dogs. One looked to be a fawn speckled with white dots, the other a mother doe, both with soulful brown eyes. In the dream Dorothy is calling out for Owen. He can see his wife is searching for him. "I'm here! I'm here!" comes his reply. Then he sees himself hurriedly running towards her, with his arms outstretched. In the imagery, he's a young man again, with his slender frame boasting broad shoulders and a thick sweep of curly black hair that his wife had always loved when he was young. Dorothy's face lights up when she sees him, and with her hands outstretched she hands him a white feather, with a big smile on her face. And then Mr. Rochester sees her running back into the woodgrove with the deers bounding buoyantly at her side, until she's all but a speck on the horizon. Every night he'd woken up from that dream with a start, his body shaking excitedly, for he felt certain that this was not a normal dream. Its symbology was very pronounced with the white feather. It meant something, and this dream was so lucidly vivid that he couldn't discard it as meaningless. For a moment, without a shadow of a doubt, he had tangibly felt his wife's presence. He knew that never once in the 80 years of his life had he ever experienced dreams quite so arrestingly profound as this, that sent goosebumps trailing down his arms. It was on this night that the woodgrove behind his home seemed to be calling him. He had never ever once in his life visited the woodgrove at night, but after his profound dreams he felt he needed to take a walk. Perhaps it was the images of his wife running down the woodland trail that made him feel a sense of being close to her, as he had experienced in that dream. He wanted to feel it all over again. Owen fumbled around in his cupboards to find the head torch, and then he put on his walking boots and his windbreaker. He trudged through the backyard to the white wicker fence, which, when he pushed open, protested with a loud creak. There was a cool breeze blowing, which whipped against his face, nudging his skin with icy fingers. The summer had been confiscated by the swift arrival of autumn, and the temperatures were beginning to dip. And without his windbreaker on, Owen knew he'd feel the cold, especially with his substantial weight loss, which meant he didn't have sufficient padding to keep the formidable elements at bay. There was a pleasing moonlight on this night, casting her auspicious prisms of pearly light across the yard, while the dusky canopy glittered with the sparkling diamonds of the stars. As Owen Rochester proceeded down the woodland trail, he was greeted to the fragrant smell of the ponderosa pine, and of course the moss, which was significantly more pronounced at night. He was happily serenaded by the reassuring trills of the crickets and frogs. The forest was so different at night. In all James' 80 years of life, he'd never taken a walk like this before, so it was an adventure of note that he was unlikely to ever forget. His heavy boots snapped forest debris, pine needles, twigs and dry autumn leaves from some of the oak trees. There was a spooky, mysterious, outer-worldly intrigue to the night, as the skyscraper-like trees became all but enigmatic vague silhouettes, where their definitive details, seen during the day, seemed scratched away under a dense tenebrific veil of obscurity, like the black crayon scribbled over a kid's drawing, to hide what it looks like underneath. The whistling wind blew through the trees. It unleashed a disturbingly low moaning sound, and as the needled boughs jiggled, it looked as if the trees themselves were shuddering nervously. For James, the pretentious mood of the forest at this time of night was a little unsettling, especially when some parts of the forest were so densely packed with trees that blocked out much of the moonlight. Despite Owen's reservations and insecurities about being alone on this woodland trail, it seemed right to be here, for reasons he could not exactly explain. In a trice his heart almost skipped a beat, when a pair of bright yellow eyes, two rounded dots in the darkness, stared back at him, and then hurriedly scurried away. It was a fox, who was less than pleased to make his acquaintance. Then he saw three pairs of silvery grey eyes, that on seeing him scampered away as fast as greased lightning. Owen realised they must be deer. No one seemed terribly enamoured to see him tonight. He could hear the hoots of owls and the distant howls of coyotes, but he ambled ever forwards, getting into the swing of things, and finding himself invigorated by walking at this late time. A brief glance at his watch confirmed it was 11 at night, close to the witching hour. Owen didn't know how long he'd been walking for, but his eyes soon adjusted to the light of his torch and the looming dark shadows. But then in a trice his confidence waned, as he had the overwhelming sense that something or someone was watching him. He stood very still for a moment, removing the little torch from his pocket, that rudely scanned the trees, but nothing was there. But the feeling of being watched persisted, and it sent prickles of dread tingling down his spine. Now he wanted nothing more than to get the hell out of this forest. What was he doing here anyway, at this insane, ungodly time? Had he lost leave of his senses? Why had he felt such an overwhelming desire to walk into the woodgrove?
when you could barely see your way ahead of you. It's the dream, he told himself. The dream I had of my wife running through the woods. I think I was hoping to see her. What was I thinking? He chastised himself, turning around to make his tracks back to the house. The urgency of his boots increased their pace, and that was when he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was being stalked, and whoever was following him was walking on 2 feet with a heavy footfall. This individual had already let out a deep guttural cough a couple of times. If there was a man following him, hiding in the dark shadows, no good could come from this. James found his mind envisaging some escaped loony from the mental asylum, or a felon keeping a low profile by hiding in the woods, with a long list of murders under his belt, wanted by the police. It was amazing what your imagination could conjure up when you became afraid. Mr. Rochester's chest tightened significantly. It felt as if his heart was being squeezed, and he could barely breathe. For a second he turned around and said, "I know you're there. Would you kindly quit following me? Leave me alone." He then turned around to continue walking back. Whoever was following him was increasing their pace behind him, stalking him in the shadows, their heavy predatory feet pounding the ground with a booming gait. Owen Rochester began to run, as the adrenaline pumped through his veins, at a rampant, supercharged speed. But even as he ran, his long, gangly legs felt like concrete blocks beneath him, and perspiration poured down his back in long ribbons. Despite the cold, he knew that whoever was running behind him was gaining speed, and then he sensed they were right behind him. Owen Rochester was so terrified, far too terrified to turn round. He had hideously macabre visions of a man with a pickaxe in his hand and a gormless, toothless grin ready to unleash upon him a deadly blow. Perhaps he'd seen too many horror movies over the years, he thought, but he was certain whatever was behind him almost certainly wanted him dead. He continued to run, and then he felt the dewy, vaporous breath of this person breathing on him. Owen wanted to scream, for he could not outrun this stranger, but he had a sense that if he looked at his aggressor, that he'd be staring death in the face. Owen realized he didn't want to die, and yet over the last few weeks he would have welcomed death gladly, to be with his wife. But now he wanted to live more than anything else in the world. The next thing he knew, a large hand touched him on the back, and Owen turned around to face his opponent. And that was when he realized that this was not an axe murderer, nor a gormless idiot with a macabre smile. It was a Bigfoot. He had heard about Bigfoot over the years, but had brushed upon the subject with only a very vague, brief interest. He had always considered it rather unlikely that such an idiosyncratic creature could actually exist in North America. But now, here he was, standing a foot away from this ponderous, mighty creature. He was in no doubt what he was perceiving. The headlight of his torch lit up the details of this enormous 9-foot creature that looked so incredibly human, with a face that rather reminded him of an Egyptian pharaoh. The Bigfoot was humongous. James suddenly became aware of how small he felt, as even at over 6 foot tall, next to the Bigfoot, he was like a fragile porcelain doll that could so easily break. The Bigfoot seemed to be studying James through his deep-set, treacle-coloured eyes that seemed devoid of any aggression. What did it want, James wondered? Why had he tapped him on the back? James was amazed when the Bigfoot spoke to him in a foreign language, which was translated into English in his head. I mean, how does that happen? Itila dog abakasi. You didn't get my message, then? James looked at the Bigfoot with his jaw dropping open, his eyes growing round in surprise. What message? He asked. Tikali kompata, ulino kolaban, isifolo shwakwa, ikinatalanito. The message I sent you in your head, for you must have got it. Otherwise, what are you doing here in the forest? I don't know, said James. Something compelled me to walk here tonight. I've never done this before. Bikitanfo, hikasno kwalaka. There you are. You got my message then. You scared me, following me like that, he said. Ipotli kutona, akila kantua, asafukulo shukolo, amasinafo. I'm sorry about that, but how am I supposed to give you a message when you're so quick to run away from me? What message? Asked James. What are you talking about?
The Bigfoot reached out to James to hand him a magnificent white feather. Ikitan pokos, asakalakwana, ilogalashana, isafokon. It's from your wife, he said. She's been nagging me to give this to you.
Where is she?
Asked James, taking the white feather from the Bigfoot. Chikitanopo, hasakwalakana safa, ushologobana, ilina tolafo, asanakwana. She says she's always watching over you. She told me to tell you that you may need to take better care of your yard and yourself, that she misses you very much, but you must know that she is always with you.
She told you that? Asked James incredulously, gawking at the Bigfoot. How could you possibly know such things?
Imo fagalani, he saw balani, ikwa dila sonosha, he fo baka sila, ozana zikalo, asikwatila.
I know many things you cannot comprehend, said the Bigfoot. I can see into the spirit realm. Your wife has been bugging me for a long time. She was most insistent about delivering the white feather to you. She said you would know exactly what it means. Now I have delivered her message to you. Hopefully your wife will get off my back now. I need to go. Godspeed, he said, and James watched the Bigfoot gliding away into the woods. He looked as if he was floating on air. So incredibly graceful. He stood there in the woodgrove looking bemused. Did that really happen? He grinned to himself as he examined the white feather in his hands. It was so typical. Even on the other side, Dorothy was so pushy, determined to get her voice heard. So much so she'd bugged a Bigfoot so she could get her message across to him. For the first time in a long time, Owen felt close to his wife, as if the veil had been lifted for a brief moment. I wasn't even afraid of the Bigfoot when he was standing only a foot away from me, he thought. But that incredible desire of mine to walk in the woodgrove in the middle of the night was actually the Bigfoot calling me. Isn't that amazing? To cut a long story short, the people in this green leafy neighbourhood in Washington state saw radical transformations in Owen Rochester. Once again, he industriously tended to his front yard, turning it into the most spectacular yard in the neighbourhood. One day he went to visit a local doggy shelter, and an old dog hours away from getting euthanized, as no one appeared to want him, looked up at Owen with a lugubrious, sorrowful expression on its face, and Owen could feel its pain. He unhesitantly rescued the dog, a hairy mongrel called Gus, that was a devoted, loving big bundle of fluff, and the dog and Owen were seen everywhere around town together. They became very bonded, and Gus was welcomed into the town's most prominent watering holes as a beloved member of the community. Owen became involved in social events in the local area, soon becoming an accomplished golfer, and he believes the changes that transpired were born about from a message he received from a Bigfoot and the white feather from his loving wife. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.